Perhaps the clearest view of developing stages of consciousness is to be found in the early Buddhist writings, the Pali, P-A-L-I, canon of Theravada Buddhism. Stages of consciousness. That's really not an accurate term, since it implies divisions or an ascending order of development. And that's not really the nature of consciousness, nor the process involved in the awareness of consciousness. Dimensions rather than stages might be more accurate. The multi-dimensional unity of consciousness, wherein any facet of the awareness of consciousness reflects a manifesting of consciousness, a point of intersection where all dimensions of consciousness are potentially possible. Oh, wow. That sounds pretty heavy. Yet, dig it. It may provide you with an entirely new perspective of your own inner space. How can I put it? Just as all life forms, plants, crickets, porpoise, men, exist potentially in every atom of hydrogen, so all potentialities of consciousness exist in every single area of consciousness. And essentially this is what mystics have always said. Nirvana is samsara, everyday reality. Nirvana is not a metaphysical entity, a dark planet out there somewhere beyond the known universe. It permeates every particle of matter. Indeed, if it not be the very nature of energy creating that matter. And this is what Zen Satori is all about. The sudden awakening to the fact you are it in the here and now. The potentialities of such an awareness always exist every second. But at this instant of a second, this timeless moment, you awaken to the realization the Buddha mind is the ordinary mind, the everyday mind. To express it in another way, you are tuned in to the radio frequencies of this station. But this is only one possibility that exists in the apparently empty space surrounding you. Potentially there are many other stations you can tune into, or many TV channels you can switch on. All of these frequencies and TV waves flowing around you at your particular intersection of space and time. And that's not even considering the cosmic rays and light waves that are streaming in from this solar system and beyond. All manner of energy manifesting itself when you tune in, be aware of. This is what the Hindus mean when they say Atman, the nitty-gritty self, stripped of the ego games, of the I-ness, is Brahma, the Absolute. The Atman, the ground of your own being, is always present, whatever shape your consciousness is in, even in moments of most extreme anxiety. As a matter of fact, stress or illness oftentimes produces an experience of cosmic consciousness. And this is what is meant when Meister Eckhart, 13th century German mystic, said, "The eye by which I see God is the same as the eye by which God sees me. My eye and God's are one and the same, one in seeing, one in knowing, and one in loving." End of quote. Your eye, whatever the present dimension of your consciousness, is the universe eyeing itself. Or another example. A man once asked Chuang-Tzu, "Show me where the Tao is found." Chuang-Tzu replied, "There is nowhere it is not found." Another man insisted, "Show me at least some definite place where Tao is found." "It is in the ant," said Chuang-Tzu. "Well, is it in some lesser being?" "It is in the weeds." "Well, can you go further down the scale of things?" "It is in this piece of tile." "Further?" "It is in this turd," replied Chuang-Tzu. And the man had nothing more to say. From a translation by Thomas Merton. So, the Tao, cosmic consciousness, unitive consciousness, nirvana, whatever name you care to give this process of realization, is not something to be achieved, a goal to be won, not a Cupid doll to be awarded by knocking over so many metaphysical milk bottles with meditational spitballs. It is always present in every dimension of consciousness. But it is only the brightly painted shoji screens of trivia we place about ourselves that prevents us from seeing the fog-enshrouded peak of unity. With this perspective, let us push our way back through these weeds of rhetoric to the early Buddhist depiction of the dimensions of consciousness. To recapitulate, the Noble Eightfold Path for the realization of nirvana is right view, right purpose, right speech, right action, right livelihood. Right effort, right mindfulness, right meditation. And incidentally, right is not the proper word either, although favored by Western translators, possibly because of their own Puritan heritage. Right as opposed to wrong is not the meaning of sam, S-A-M. And every one of these steps is always preceded by the prefix sam. For example, right meditation is samma samadhi, S-A-M-M-A, S-A-M-A-D-H-I. Sam really means the middle way, or equanimity. So, it is not right meditation as opposed to wrong meditation, but meditation with or enjoyed through equanimity. And even steps as applied to the Eightfold Path is not accurate. The Eightfold Path, folds of a total unity, not steps to achieve something. The Eightfold Path is the unfolding, fold by fold, of a realization. a happening, like the unfolding of a rose. Now note the contrast to the 8 limbs of yoga of which I talked about previously. They were, if you remember, abstention, devotion, posture, relaxation of breathing, retraction of senses, fixation of attention, fuse of apprehension, and finally, full integration of consciousness, samadhi. Here apparently you have a plan of action to achieve samadhi. A word of explanation. Yoga probably grew out of primitive shamanistic practices. Many postures are still named after animals, a possible carryover from the shaman imitating a familiar, an animal, so it might guide him into, or guide him through the spiritual realms. A favorite symbol used among shamans was the tree of life. And in trance, the shaman was supposed to ascend this tree of life into the sky world. So it could well be that the limbs of yoga refer to the limbs of the tree of life upon which you climb. Some of you might ask, why translate samadhi in yoga as integration of consciousness and samma samadhi in Buddhism as right meditation? Well, samadhi has many meanings. Putting or adhering together, and that's interesting in the light that the Jewish mystic thought of final realization as adhering to Jehovah, but it also can mean a completion. So the yogi, placing his fragile grid of words and realizing the inadequacy of such words, over this process of consciousness, arbitrarily names the experience of liberation or release or enlightenment as samadhi, and more specifically, nirbija samadhi, the supreme transcendental consciousness. On the other hand, Buddha seemed to feel that this final dimension of consciousness, as experienced in meditation, was not the total realization of enlightenment, and therefore you needed a separate word denoting total realization, nirvana. The sam in samma samadhi means not only equanimity, but can also mean sameness. Sam and our word same are derived from the same root. So he thought of the final dimension of consciousness experienced in meditation as possessing characteristics similar or the same as nirvana, but not the experiencing of nirvana itself. Therefore, you meditate to experience the final dimension of consciousness in samma samadhi, which allows you to verify such a consciousness exists. But to make that final plunge into nirvana, you must possess understanding. To quote from the Dhammapada, where Buddha is speaking to Ananda, quote, "And presently I passed wholly from the sphere of neither ideation or non-ideation, and entered and stayed at the ending of ideation and feeling." I'll get into these dimensions of consciousness in a moment. But he is speaking of the final dimension of consciousness, as experienced in meditation. And then he continues, and by seeing and understanding, my obsessions were destroyed. End of quote. By obsessions, he refers to desirousness, goal achieving, and ignorance. So the experience of nirvana does not come automatically as a result of even the highest level of meditation, but an act of understanding, prajna, is also needed. And this is even more dramatically illustrated by another quotation. Quote, "The destruction of the obsessions is to be realized by means of understanding." End of quote. Now, Buddha said, by seeing and understanding, obsessions were destroyed. So, I would substitute awareness for this understanding and seeing. Therefore, Buddha recognized two classes of mystics, arhats. Those who are freed, liberated, by meditation and understanding, whom he refers to as, quote, freed in both ways, end of quote, and those who are freed by understanding alone. Generally, it was thought being freed both ways was more satisfactory, because just to hope for understanding or awareness would be just another faith trip. Now, to underline the difference between the yogic and Buddhist approaches, and this difference is only one of classification, not of experience, Buddha saw 8 dimensions of consciousness existing in Samma Samadhi. So there is an 8-fold path, and in the last or 8th fold there is also 8 dimensions of consciousness. Now, we shall try to experience these dimensions by metaphor or device in a moment. But the final dimension of consciousness, as expressed by Buddha, is the ending of ideation and feelings, in other words, a consciousness beyond the contradiction of contraries, consciousness beyond thought, sensation, or image. Then the big question: what is the difference between this final dimension of consciousness and the experiencing of nirvana, or cosmic consciousness, or Tao, or God consciousness? I would say that this final dimension of consciousness is equivalent to the Christian concept of sensing the presence of God, spiritually betrothed, before the union of God, spiritual marriage. The Buddhist scriptures refer to this consciousness as where the body touches nirvana, a minor satori in Zen. The stilling of the surface mind. But for a total integration of consciousness, the experiencing of the undifferentiated unity of consciousness, which remains with you after the ending of the experience, then there must be the presence of awareness, understanding, so that there can be an existential rebirth, a re-synthesis of the ego, which is the experiencing of nirvana, spiritual marriage, complete satori, a transformed state of personality and consciousness, where there is maintained an almost half-conscious, permanent background of serenity, equanimity, which can always be actualized, and against which an individual's surface consciousness still functions in everyday reality. This would be the meaning of the unitive life, where the Christian mystic participated in daily activities but still maintained this background of unitive consciousness. And this would be the state of no-mind of a bodhisattva, or the Taoist who lived wu-wei, actionless activity, or it would be the meaning of the Hindu symbol, the still center of a moving wheel. But again, emphasizing that this experience of nirvana, this existential rebirth, this installation of a permanent background of unitive consciousness, can be realized in any dimension of consciousness, through prajna, understanding awareness, the choiceless awareness of Krishnamurti, or Taoist perception, the non-evaluating, non-judgmental awareness of non-differences. Okay, what were these 8 dimensions of consciousness in Samma Samadhi? Well, the first 4 dimensions are those usually experienced in contemplation, what the Hindus call meditation with seed. That is, you are looking at an object, any selected object, flower, mandala, whatever. And as you meditate, you are aware of the thoughts running through your mind like monkeys chasing each other's tails. But you don't try to suppress those thoughts as you look at this object. You merely allow them to flow on out, always returning your attention to the object. Then gradually you discover that those background thoughts begin to slow down and gradually disappear. At the same time, a certain joy begins to develop. A joy that seems to arise out of your reaching out to that object. Now only the object remains in your mind. Without background thoughts, so that it develops into a fusive apprehension, as though there's no longer any difference between the seer and the seen, the knower and the known. And this joy develops into serenity or even-mindedness. Now that would be the first 4 dimensions of consciousness. But now the 5th dimension. As you continue to gaze at this object, the only object within your mind, the outlines of that object began to expand. It's as though you are beginning to see through that object into infinite space beyond, as though you were using a telescope, or that object becomes a telescope through which you look at the empty sky beyond, like sitting on a mountaintop and gazing at the sky. This is what the Buddhists call the awareness of infinite space. then the next stage, that infinite space out there, and it's still out there, becomes merged with your own consciousness. It's as though you flipped your eyes over and now realized the infinity of your own empty consciousness. Again, it's as though first you are looking at empty space out there. You flip your eyes over, and that empty space becomes the emptiness or infinity of your own consciousness. But still, it is an inner consciousness, still the vaguest idea. And you go beyond that to the next stage, to the experiencing of nothingness, to a truly experiencing of nothingness of that empty consciousness. A nothingness which is at the same time a fullness. That is pregnant with all the possibilities of growth. The emptiness before creation. And let me illustrate this for you. I'm going to make a sound. Then I will stop that sound and see if you can experience the fullness of no sound, the fullness of emptiness. Okay? That feeling of hearing silence. Hearing silence, the fullness of silence, the fullness of emptiness. And perhaps that gives you something of the sense of experiencing nothingness, which is at the same time fullness. Okay, let's go beyond even that stage of nothingness, into the stage of neither consciousness nor non-consciousness. This was a transitional stage. And I can only illustrate this again by ringing the bell. And this time, instead of perceiving the silence, see if you can absorb yourself into that silence. See if you can become that silence. And this would be equivalent to neither perception nor non-perception, neither consciousness nor non-consciousness, just being that silence. Okay? All right. Did you feel as though you were being absorbed into that silence, as though you were becoming that silence? Let's try it again. Now, did you feel as though you were absorbed in that silence? Neither perception nor non-perception. Not even the idea of nothingness, but just the experience of being. And then finally, the last dimension of consciousness is pure consciousness, without thought, sensation, or image, not even the thought of perception or non-perception. The oneness, undifferentiated unity of consciousness. Now, as to where you go beyond that depends upon your awareness, your understanding. Thank you for sharing this time with me. Shanti. Shanti.